Iran could have hit back much harder, but Iran chose not to do so because what Iran wanted to say is that, look, the United States we can hit the United. Trump says, don't touch us. Iran touched them, and Trump didn't do anything. Some would say, well, you should have fired 500 missiles. Yes, maybe, we could do that. But the focus is on Israel, and Israel would love to see a war between Iran and the United States because that would ease the burden on the Israeli regime. And if there is a war between Iran and the United States and there's a global economic crisis, then the international community will look at our region differently. We want the focus to be on American aggression. We want it to be focused on Israeli illegitimacy. So Iran hit back at the Americans to send a message, which I think was impressive. You're hitting Israel, the Israeli regime, simultaneously as the Americans, and you're also sending a message to these despotic regimes that do nothing for the Palestinians. Qatar is no friend of the Palestinians. No is the Emir. These regimes are in the American camp. Anyone who thinks otherwise is just deceiving themselves. And of course, there are lots of people on the payroll. 21 months, we've seen nothing from any of these countries. The Republic of Azerbaijan in bed with the Israeli regime. Erdogan in bed with the Israeli regime. Qatar, Emirates, Jordan, all of them are in bed with the Israeli regime. There's no doubt about it. So, if people want to direct their anger, they should direct them at those who are in bed with the Israeli regime. I think what Iran did was impressive, but it's in the interest of the Israeli regime for Iran to get into a war with the United States. That's what they want. So why should we do what they want? The Americans don't want it because it would be destructive for them. Why should we, let the Israeli regime get away with it, start a different war? Iran is prepared for a war with the United States. Iran is prepared to take out the Persian Gulf, all its assets. But that's the last case scenario. Your own viewers, if that happens, they will not have jobs. They will not have internet. Our world tomorrow will not be the world that we are living in right now. That's a heavy price to pay for everyone. So if the Israelis want it, then I think people should assume that we should be careful not to do what the Israeli regime wants. Iran hasn't used some of its key assets because it doesn't want the Israelis to know how to deal with them. It has a diverse set of missiles and drones to use against the Israeli regime, and it tries not to use everything so that it can remain an unknown for future. And again, the vast majority of Iranian missiles have not been used. They've been untouched. Iran, and for example, they spoke about destroying launchers. First of all, a lot of those images of launchers were just decoys and missiles. And you saw there was no secondary explosions. The same is true with radar and so on. But Iran has thousands of launchers. Iran doesn't, like the Israelis were saying they have 300 or something. They have thousands of launchers. Even if you look at just one or two of the bases when they're opened up, when they were first opened up and we saw footage of them, we saw just from that footage in each case, tens, if not almost 100 launchers just in a single base in the parts that we saw. So Iran doesn't have a shortage of anything. What it has to do, I think, is that it has to strengthen its air defense systems, strengthen its capabilities for drones. And that is more than doable because Iran has developed air defense systems itself. It has good technology and it has very good relations with countries that are very advanced in this regard. So I think it's going to be a top priority. The Israelis are in trouble. The Iranians, I think they came out on top. Again, the only segment of Iranian society that I've seen that is unhappy are those who said, let's keep fighting. But I think the argument in Iran goes that, if we keep fighting, ultimately it's going to end with a ceasefire. And it's going to end with a crisis at home for Netanyahu, and it's going to end with more Iranians, civilians being killed. If Iran feels that it had the upper hand, despite the blitzkrieg, despite the betrayal of the regime in Washington, then why not have this ceasefire sooner rather than later? I would understand if for example, if Iran had a ceasefire before, like on day 3 or day 4 or day 5, I would say, no, that's not right. Because the Israelis they still had the advantage and the Iranians were, regrouping and they were beginning to, they restored the balance, but they were still, hurt from day one because what happened on day 1. But now I think it would just be, we would keep striking them. They would keep striking us. We would keep striking them. It would not be good for them. But at the end, it would end in the ceasefire. And the same sort of situation that Netanyahu is going to be experiencing in the days and weeks ahead would be experienced with a greater delay. I think that's the calculation. What this war did, Nima, is that it united Iranian society in an unprecedented way since Saddam Hussein invaded. The only thing that I'm just guessing, but from what I can see so far, the only segment of society that is dissatisfied now are those who said we should have continued the war. Everyone else says that Iran has every right to fight and that Iran is in the right and the West is aggressive and they've murdered people and they're dishonest and deceitful and they don't work in good faith. That is the consensus now anyway. Those who are unhappy say we should have continued to hammer the Israeli regime, which is a legitimate argument. I'm not saying that they have no argument to make. However, I think the calculation in Iran is that they want to keep global public opinion, not just in the region, but across the globe, and meaning including governments, on their side. Because there has been a sea change in public opinion about Palestine, about Iran, about the resistance over the past 21 months. But over the past 11, 12 days, it has increased, this shift. And Russia, China, and other BRICS nations have tilted closer to Iran. And Iran sees this as detrimental to the Israeli regime. And so since Netanyahu was the side who was begging for a ceasefire, and the Iranians did not want to expand the war because it would create a global economic catastrophe, the Iranians calculated, rightly or wrongly, that now would be the time to end the war so that there would be less suffering among ordinary Iranians because the Israelis bomb ordinary people. Most of the people who died are ordinary people. And so that the global South will see Iran as the responsible actor, and they'll continue to view the Israeli regime as the aggressor. Now, I think the most important thing that happens here is that Netanyahu is severely weak. And I think there will be implications inside Israeli society. So he will, of course, try to spin it in a way to make it look as if he's won. But I think it's clear that Israel has shown itself no longer to be invincible. Iran, every single day, hammered the regime. And the final hours, it was Iran that was hitting the regime left and right until the end, the cessation of hostilities. So that, the Israeli regime has lost faith. The image has been destroyed along with the West because of the genocide in Gaza and the genocidal attacks on Lebanon. And in the case of Iran, it was also seen as aggressive and attacking civilian nuclear assets. The world condemned it. Forget the West. The world condemned it, but the majority. But I think that in addition to all that, the Israeli regime has been seen as militarily very vulnerable. It could bomb Iran, and part of it was because, as I said, it was a sudden attack, and they took out some of Iran's air defense and air defense radar and air defense capabilities. But it was being hit very hard. I think that is something new for the regime. Esfahan is easily replaced. It's not something huge, and it's not something difficult for Iran. Natanz was less well protected anyway. But Iran removed its assets from Natanz. From what seems to be the case is that the United States informed Iran beforehand, and Iran removed assets from Fordow. So the most important thing about Fordow is the scientists, and overwhelmingly they're alive. A few scientists were murdered along with their families and neighbors and children and friends, but overwhelmingly they're alive. So they're the most important thing. The second most important thing is the equipment. Iran has that. And Iran, what made Fordow and everything else, there are factories across the country that do that. So Iran has this broad infrastructure across the country. This is not irreplaceable, and the assets apparently were moved. I don't know secrets. I don't know what happened in Fordow. I know that many Americans are now saying that there wasn't damage, and Trump is saying that it was totally destroyed. I don't know. I don't think it was totally destroyed, but it's based on the guess, and it's based on things that people have said to me who I'm not entirely sure they know. But there are people who don't talk nonsense in general, but that doesn't mean that they're right. So I don't know what happened at Fordo, but there was, without a doubt, damage. There was damage to Iran's radars, there was damage to Iran's air defenses, there was damage to civil society, there was people killed, there was damage to people's homes, to hospitals, to the Red Crescent Society, and to the nuclear program. But a couple of things come out of this. One is that Iran has a stronger hand in dealing with the International Atomic Energy Agency because it betrayed Iran. And that strengthens Iran's nuclear program in its own way in the long run. Two, that segment of Iranian society that thought that the West was friendly and that the problem is ours, liberals, parts of the upper middle class, the upper class, their worldview has been shattered, and they see the West, the United States, for what it is, especially since it betrayed Iran at the negotiating table. And the U.S. struck Iran right after Iran negotiated with the European three. So with regards to public perceptions, things are not good for the West. And I think it's going to increase or strengthen the narrative in Iran, or the argument, I should say, the argument in Iran for improving relations with the global South. And I think the current administration is also looking in that direction, that we should focus more on the global South rather than rapprochement with the West. So that, these are serious things that will have an impact in the days ahead. Again, the dissatisfaction that exists is among those who say we should have continued. And I know some of Iran's supporters abroad are saying, no, Iran should have done more. The government has to calculate a number of things. One is it has to calculate, is it worth having all these people killed? What do you get out of having more civilians murdered by the Israeli regime? Do you get more leverage? Is it going to change the situation in the Israeli regime? And two, Iran has to look in the long run that it wants to consolidate its position and the position of the resistance in the global South. Because in the long run, Israel is not going to be defeated by armed forces. It's not going to be overrun. That's never been the plan. The plan has always been to degrade it until it finally becomes unsustainable. That's how it's always been. There's never been anything other, and that is what the resistance has done in this 2021 months. They keep saying Hezbollah has been weakened. Hezbollah also weakened Israel. Hamas has been weakened. Hamas has weakened Israel. Islamic Jihad has been weakened. Islamic Jihad has weakened Israel. Ansarullah has weakened Israel. And Iran has, more than anyone else, weakened Israel. So Israel is much weaker than before. It is despised across the world, and that is going down the right path. But if Iran wants to, in the long run, outmaneuver the regime, to defeat the regime, it wants to have friends across the world, people, public opinion, which is now with Iran. People see Iran as the hope and the resistance as the hope. But also Iran wants governments to be on its side because that strengthens the resistance. So Iran has to show the international community, the global South, that we're not just out there to kill, or we're not just out there to create some sort of regional war and economic crisis. We are the sane actors. We are the reasonable actors. They are insane. They are unreasonable. They are dangerous. They target civilian nuclear programs. And I think that has been a success. Yes, I would love it if Iran could keep hammering the Israeli regime without having anyone killed and with the whole international community cheering on. But Iran has many calculations. Based on those calculations, it said that, okay, now is the time. Netanyahu is begging. Let him now pay the political price at home. So let's see how it plays out inside the regime. For 40-some years, the issue has been regime change. It has been undermining Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran, because Iran is fiercely independent, unlike other countries across the region. But in this case, just as important, Iran is the supporter of the Palestinian cause. And that is what makes the West so outraged and angry and intolerant of Iran. So that has always been the objective. And the Israeli regime miscalculated. We discussed this earlier. Iranian society has always viewed the Islamic Republic as legitimate, the legitimate state in Iran, whether the West likes it or not. People may be dissatisfied. Of course they are. They're always dissatisfied. Iranians in general, as you know, are people who we are usually dissatisfied. If we sit together among friends, we never say anything positive about a government, any government, or about the metro or airlines or anything or prices. That's just how we are. And of course, under sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that we've had for years, a part of Iran's sacrifice for being independent and supporting Palestine, it's been more difficult. But as I said, the legitimacy of the state in Iran is high. But what the Israelis actually did and what the Americans did is that they strengthened the state, because that segment of Iranian society that would consider itself to be Western oriented, or maybe they don't consider themselves to be Western oriented, but I would say they're Western, especially among the middle class parts, large parts of the middle class, not all of them, large parts of them, and the upper middle class, not all of them, but again, a large segment of them. Their worldview has been devastated because they've seen the United States show deceit, and they've seen that Iran was negotiating, and then the Americans betrayed Iran and were deceitful and dishonest. And that wasn't just Trump. When he initiated the conflict against Iran or supported it, we saw liberal media in the West support him. CNN and Fox News played the same role. Breitbart and the New York Times played the same role. One may use more bombastic language, and the other may be a bit more sophisticated in its propaganda. But young Iranians, educated Iranians who thought differently for whatever reason, confronted reality. So I think the West has done itself a lot, has damaged itself among this class of Iranians. Also, I would say that this has created a permanent mistrust in Iran among the government and among elites towards the West. And it will quicken Iran's move towards the global South and towards BRICS and towards Asian powers to cooperate with them. It's going to make it much, much more difficult ever to work with Western countries anytime in the future, because the West supported the aggression. The Europeans supported airstrikes. And when Israel carried out an unprovoked assault, they called it an act of defense. So people in Iran, elites in Iran, see that. And also one thing, Nima, one advantage that this has, it's war. A lot of damage was done, obviously. Although, again, Iranian missiles are much more devastating than the Israeli missiles. The Israeli missiles, their payload is much smaller. But one advantage that this has for the Iranian government as a card to play with is Iran's relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In future, Iran is not going to give them that sort of access that they would have in the past, if any. And there's a debate in Iran about leaving the NPT, not producing a nuclear weapon, but just leaving so that the West would no longer know what's happening, so that the International Atomic Energy Agency would no longer pass on information to Israel to assassinate people, to bomb targets. So it's going to make, ironically, it's going to make things more difficult for the United States and the West. The fact is that the Israeli regime carried out an act of war. They initiated war. It was a blitzkrieg. They murdered people as they were with friends and family. It was the night of Eid and celebration. They destroyed some of the Iranian air defense systems and radars during the first few hours. And so since a lot of the senior commanders, 6, 7 senior commanders, I don't remember the exact number, they were martyred, it took time for the Iranians to regroup. But after a few hours, Iran began to fire its missiles, and then it began to regroup and begin the fight. And progressively, things got worse for the regime. And that's why Netanyahu was basically begging for Trump to get involved, and Trump carried out his own act of war. Again, we have to remember that all of this was happening as Iran was negotiating. But Trump was lying. He was dishonest. He was deceitful. He was plotting against Iran as he was negotiating. And it now turns out that it's not just that he was plotting since almost possibly the beginning of the negotiations. But apparently this attack has been planned from previous administrations for over a decade now. But I'm sure we'll get more information about that in the future. So After the U.S. strike, which is a different issue we can cover, Netanyahu he began to beg for a ceasefire, and the Iranians continued it until this morning. While Iran has been hurt, there's no doubt about that. After all, again, it was a sudden attack. It was a blitzkrieg attack like Nazi Germany. Some of Iran's important radar assets and air defense assets were damaged and destroyed during those first hours. But Iran regrouped. It hit hard. It wasn't Iran that asked for a ceasefire. It was the Israeli regime. And Iran continued. And ultimately, during the last 2-3 hours before the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities took effect, the Iranians were hammering different parts of the Israeli regime from north to south to send a message that we can continue with this. I would say that this is a win for Iran. Now, it wasn't a decisive defeat for the regime where it comes to the edge of collapse or anything like that, but it was a win for Iran. And the biggest loser of all, I think, is Netanyahu personally, because he showed that the Israeli regime is not invincible. This is the first time that the regime is being hit day and night, every single day, by missiles, heavy missiles. Iranian missiles are much more devastating than Israeli missiles. Israeli missiles have small warheads, they're fired from aircraft. The Iranian missiles have huge payloads. So every time an Iranian missile strikes, it causes enormous damage. And of course, the cost of the Israeli air defense system, as your viewers know, is enormous itself. So every time Iran fires a drone, and Iran has been firing hundreds, I think probably maybe 1,000 drones, I don't know, we'll have to see the numbers. They'll probably come out ultimately. And many of them have been hitting their targets, but they've not been the focus because the missiles have such more, they have much bigger impact. So the Israelis have been spending huge amounts of money to block drones and missiles. So even if they hit the drone, they're paying 15, 20 times as much as the Iranians have. In fact, many of these drones, not all, I don't know the percentage, but many of these drones and many of these missiles are very old. And so they were in stock, and the Iranians have been getting rid of them. Again, I'm not saying that the Iranians weren't hurt. The Israelis killed lots of people. They killed lots of women and children. Last night, they bombed the hospital not far from here. I think I would say it's an hour's distance walk. And outside of Tehran, they bombed a building in a city in the north, and they wiped out 2 families in that apartment building, in that building, and they've been hitting different areas. It's been largely targeting civilians, especially during the previous night. But throughout, it's mostly been civilians. In some cases, they struck buildings that belong to the armed forces, but most of them were already empty. From day one, everything has been emptied. I remember when I was at Press TV during the interviews, during the first couple of days, they had evacuated everyone from the building. But as I was doing the interviews, there was always a couple of people in the building taking out all of the sensitive electronic equipment that's expensive. So that's what was happening across Tehran and elsewhere, and especially in key and sensitive sites. So most of the casualties as a result were civilian, and a lot of the government buildings or military buildings that were hit were largely empty. They murdered a senior government official who worked for Ministry of Energy. She was the head of statistics for Iran's electrical power plants. They struck their building, again, a civilian, and murdered her. But that's just how the Israeli regime works. They don't care about people. They have no red lines. They don't consider non-Zionists to be human. We are all considered to be subhuman. And of course, the West is the same. Western elites consider us to be subhuman. That's why they support the Israelis throughout the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust there, the genocidal strikes in Lebanon, and of course, the attacks on Iran. One advantage that this war had, although Iran's nuclear infrastructure was damaged, no doubt about it. But first of all, Iran has many scientists. Natanz is easily it can easily be built. It's not that difficult. Fordo was never a priority for Iran. Natanz was never a priority because Fordo was well protected. We have to see how badly Fordo was damaged. But it is clear that Iran took out its key assets from all of these installations before they were struck. And in the case when the Americans struck, I think, and I don't know, I really don't know, I don't have inside information, but it seems that the Americans told the Iranians beforehand, and the Iranians emptied many things, just like the Iranians warned beforehand when they struck Qatar and the American CENTCOM center there. Trump says, something every day. Trump said he was against the war, and the next day he was gloating about supporting the Israelis and being behind it. Nothing that Trump says we should take at face value. He wakes up in the morning, says something. He's a serial liar. He's dishonest and politically. He's deceitful. He's deceitful. So anything that he says really doesn't matter. And if President Putin says something, you have to check the wording. But if Trump says something, you don't even know if he was, what he was up to that morning or what had happened that afternoon. So I wouldn't take that seriously. He said, he spoke about many things when it comes to Iran, and many things when it comes to China, and many things when it comes to Russia and others. But he couldn't achieve them. Iran will continue to develop its nuclear program. The empire is weakening. Israel has faced a severe defeat. Netanyahu, in particular, has suffered a major defeat. Time is on Iran's side. And Iran will continue to take advantage of this fact that time is on its side.